Hey everyone, welcome back to another AskGN. For this episode, we have a special guest answer from JonnyGuru from the famous Power Supply review website. He also works at Corsair these days on the Power Supply team, so we'll be getting to that in a moment. And also, leave your questions in the comment section below if you have questions for the next week's 2 episodes. We're shooting 3 today. 2 of them will be on the main channel. 1 will go to the Patreon backers at patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd like to get access to the bonus episode. And then finally, we've got a couple of community questions that are really good as well. And our second episode that we're filming for this one will have one of the overclockers, either Der Bauer or BuildZoid, joining in for an answer. But we'll get to that in the next video. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake's View 37 case. The View 37 focuses on highlighting custom PC builds with its full panoramic window and tinted front acrylic. In our thermal testing, the View 37 performed reasonably well when considering its looks-focused build, which is partly thanks to the airflow design and the removal of a bottom power supply shroud. For a balance of looks and performance, check the link in the description below for the View 37. So just before the first question, to point out again, we have new posters in. These are pretty sweet. They are video card component, basically GPU or video card anatomy posters. It shows things like where the inductors are, MOSFETs, memory, all that stuff. So if you're into posters, we have them on store.gamersnexus.net. You can pick them up now. They are shipping now as orders come in, and they're brand new. So thank you for the interest for those of you who picked up the first ones. Quick aside on that, I signed the first 10 of them that I came across when we were quality checking. They are going to go out at random in the first round of shipments. So if you order one, you might get one of the signed ones. They're signed and numbered 1 out of 10. So first question, this is going back to the previous week's 2 episodes where one of our viewers asked about Japanese capacitors. Basically, what's the deal with Japanese capacitors? You see on motherboard boxes, video card boxes, basically where the vendors are saying it has Japanese caps, and that's supposed to be enough to get you interested in buying it. So clearly, there is this idea that Japanese capacitors are just inherently better quality. But one would assume that, like most things, it's possible for any country to house companies that are capable of making bad things too. So we pitched this question. We asked BuildZoid about it last week, and he basically came to the conclusion of, well, I don't know of any bad Japanese capacitors offhand on motherboards that I work with, is sort of what BuildZoid is getting at. And so as far as he was concerned, it's reasonable marketing. We asked JonnyGuru as well, who is very particular about his capacitors. JonnyGuru from JonnyGuru.com, formerly and now at Corsair these days, is probably one of the most qualified people to talk to this question on the power supply front. So he said, quote, "They're not always better per se. That just gives you a sense of security because so far there are currently no bad Japanese capacitors. There are lots of Chinese and Taiwanese brand caps that are just as good, but who's going to tour you through a factory and hold your hand through a data sheet to explain how when you can just buy a Japanese brand?" And I interjected here in the conversation and basically said, I get you, so it's just easier to market Japanese brand capacitors because the Taiwan or China brand capacitors are potentially have a lower floor of quality than Japanese capacitors. So that is what I took away from that, and Johnny agreed that's what he was trying to convey. Further said, and he's got a couple of analogies here, it's like if someone says we're going to see a flick directed by Christopher Nolan, you know it's probably going to be a great movie no matter what, Japanese capacitors. Whereas someone says, let's see a John Carpenter flick, and you end up with Ghosts of Mars instead of The Thing. Yes, it's a fair marketing bullet point, but it doesn't automatically make a product better. You can't take a crappy product and make it better with Japanese capacitors. Likewise, if you use the wrong cap in the wrong application, you still end up with trouble waiting to happen. Like a set of Brembo brakes isn't going to suddenly make a Chevy Aveo a great car, or Aveo if you prefer. So there's your analogies. Hopefully one of those 2 works for you. To expand on this, what Mr. Guru is getting at is the marketing overall. Japanese capacitors presently, as they're made today, they grew sort of in popularity, as many of you pointed out in the last episode, from a capacitor plague that affected a lot of the caps back, I don't know if it was the late 90s or early 2000s. And so Japanese capacitors grew to great popularity after that and during that event because they dodged this capacitor plague where caps would just up and die. And actually a few of you noted that you worked on boards during that cap plague and made a lot of money from replacing capacitors. So it's that is a particular piece of knowledge I didn't have before. I appreciate your comments on that. But expanding on what Johnny was saying here, Jon Gerow from Corsair these days, it's fair marketing. It's just that if the VRM on the motherboard itself is not a good VRM, if it has bad MOSFETs, or if it's kind of cheating the phase design like we've talked about in recent videos with some motherboards, the Japanese capacitors won't just fix that problem. So there could still be underlying problems, and you still ultimately have to pick a capacitor that works for the application. So great answer from JonnyGuru. And he's at Corsair these days if you're curious what he's been up to. It's also helping us figure out some power supply testing that we'll be doing more of in the near future as we move into our office that we've briefly mentioned in the past. Next question. TechProfessor says, with the expected launch of new hardware later in August and traditional annual hardware generation updates each fall, when would you consider the sweet spot to start a new build? So yeah, there should be obviously product updates in quarter 3 and 4. There always are. So it's kind of hard to answer that. We don't know how they're going to perform right now. The way I always answer this question of should I buy or wait is pretty straightforward. With the system you have today, are you happy with it? Is it holding you back in any ways that are, if it's a production system, is it costing you money in terms of time? If it's a gaming system, are you just not enjoying it? If you're happy with how it is, just keep using it, because new hardware is always a couple months away. If you don't need something today, then just wait. If you are unhappy with it, if it's holding you back, especially if it's a work system that it's costing you money, then probably just start upgrading. But keep in mind that there are a lot of rumors about new GPUs. We don't actually know anything about them yet. We don't know when they're launching, if they're launching, and eventually there will be some, but don't know the specs of them, don't know how they're supposed to perform. Some of the leaks that are out there, I can tell you with certainty, are incorrect. So it's really hard to say how long you should wait, or if you should at all, because we could be looking at weeks to months. GPUs often sell out too when they first launch. So if there is a launch, there's no guarantee you're going to get one. Also, pricing, we don't know what kind of position they have in the performance stack. We don't know. CPUs, we don't 100% know when Intel's launching their next stuff. We know that the 8 cores are supposed to come out probably by quarter 4. It's just we don't have pricing. So if you're thinking I'm going to buy a 6-core 8700K or just wait for an 8-core, there's no guarantee that 8-core is the same price as a 6-core. So waiting for it might not matter if it ends up out of your budget because it costs more than a 6-core anyway. So to answer your question, if you wait maybe 2 or 3 months, that's when we should know everything there is to know about what's launching in the last half of the year. If you can't wait that long because your system's holding you back, then just buy now, because it doesn't matter what you do. It's always going to be obsolete within a couple of months, because that's how quickly the industry turns over. So there's always something new around the corner. There's no reason feeling buyer's remorse or anything like that if something new comes out within a couple months of you buying, because that's almost 100% of the time going to happen. So you just buy based on how you're feeling right now about your system, and that's all there is to it. Don't try and like min-max your performance to dollar if it's making you suffer today. But if you can hold off, then I guess hold off. It's a pretty basic answer, really. SoLaLa says, do GPUs have some kind of casual-proof OC protection? I thought so and maxed out the GPU and memory frequencies in my palit OC software because I was curious. My PC just restarted and frequencies were back to normal. It worked fine for another 2 days, but suddenly it wouldn't start in regular mode. Then in save mode, it showed blue and pink vertical lines, distorted colors. I guess I fried it. Was this my fault, or did I just accelerate the end of the product life? Temps were 65C at 100% load, and I didn't mess with the voltages. It was a 780 Super Jetstream. Couple things here. Do they have casual proof OC protection? Yes. It's maybe not as much for your protection as much as it is just making sure you can't overclock it too high and invalidate the next product category up. But it's effectively a protection. So the 780 and everything after it, and on the NVIDIA side, you can't really change voltage that much. And it's typically voltage that starts to kill things, either indirectly from increasing the heat or directly from just being too much voltage. The 780, Maxwell Pascal, and even Volta on the Titan V, they have extremely limited voltage overvolting headroom. So you really can't do a lot of damage unless you start doing things like shunt mods incorrectly. If you do a shunt mod on a shunt resistor like one of these and dump liquid metal all over the solder joints, that's a problem. Just a quick side note, I know there's been some discussion about that lately. If you're careful with your liquid metal application and not an idiot, i.e. you don't just like smear it all over the solder joints, it won't fall off the board. I know some people have seen that happening, but just be careful about your liquid metal application, that'll be fine. So unless you're doing that, and you're also just not cautious while applying the liquid metal, it's pretty hard to kill a video card from overclocking. Just increasing frequency is not enough unless you're also running way over temperature. So at 65 degrees, you're perfectly within operating range. You didn't touch the voltage, not that you could really do it anyway. You didn't do any BIOS mods, it doesn't sound like. So unless you're doing one of those things, it's pretty hard to kill it. It could be complete coincidence. It could be the drivers got screwy. Sometimes when you're overclocking and stuff crashes during the course of an overclock, you can sort of corrupt the drivers or corrupt 3D Mark installations. I've done it all the time. So I would recommend go to Wagner software and download DDU, Display Driver Uninstaller. It's free. Go boot into safe mode with DDU. It has an option in it to do that. Do the clean uninstall of the NVIDIA drivers, and then reboot, install the NVIDIA drivers clean, reboot, and hopefully it's fixed. You might have just corrupted the drivers. It's possible that you're talking about distorted colors. Often that means some kind of memory issue, either memory over temperature, or if you like bend a PCB too much, you can sort of crack or disengage the traces to the memory, and that'll cause the distorted colors. So if you haven't messed with the card physically, it's clearly not that. But it's possible that, as it is a couple years old now, maybe there's dust in between the thermal pads and the memory modules. Maybe thermal paste is drying up. So do the driver thing first. If that doesn't work, restart or shut down actually, pull the card and just take it apart. It's really easy. Anyone can do it. Be careful when you remove the fan headers. As long as you're careful with those, not to rip the cables out of the header, you'll be fine. Clean off the thermal paste, reapply it, and check the thermal pads, maybe apply new ones. Try and get something that's the same height as the ones you have. Measure it with with like digital calipers and you'll be fine. So that's what I would do. If after reapplying paste and checking the thermal pads, making sure everything's making contact thermally, if it's still having problems, let us know again. I'll keep an eye out for your name, but those would be the two troubleshooting steps I would suspect would help. As far as overclocks resetting, they typically do that when restarting, especially if they were unsuccessful anyway. So I wouldn't panic just yet. It sounds like a coincidence, or it sounds like it was the catalyst to just something that was going to overheat at some point anyway, finally overheating. But hopefully it's just a matter of getting that, whatever that component is, back into good contact. So those are my thoughts on that. Yes, they are casual proof in general. You can't really overclock even AMD cards. Neither vendor allows you to overclock in ways that are extreme enough to seriously damage them unless you're also way over temperature. And you weren't. Next one, ProtoAMP says, this might be a stupid question, but why does fan reporting software often have different RPM than what you would expect? If the max RPM of a fan is 1500 as per the spec sheet, I'm somehow able to get 1600 when it's set to 100%. Similarly, if I set to 50% speed, I end up getting 1100 RPM, which isn't the 750 or 800 RPM I would expect. Maybe it takes into account minimum RPMs, or am I missing something? It's actually definitely not a stupid question. It's a very good question. There are a lot of things that cause RPM variance. The first one to point out, and this is separate from what you're talking about, is a hardware level. So the motors and just the fan itself, but especially the motors, have a natural variance. So I have like 15 of the same fan to my left on the floor, and every one of those is going to have a slightly different maximum and minimum RPM. It typically varies by about plus or minus 10% of the advertised spec on the website. If they claim it'll be 1000 RPM, you might get one that's 1100, you might get one that's something like 900. And that's just from manufacturing tolerances. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The advertised number might be plus or minus 10% of what you get in reality. And we actually talked about that in our Corsair H100i Pro review that went live a couple days ago, where the H100i Pro has two fans where one of them was spinning like 50 to 100 RPM lower than the other one. The other part of this is you're talking about setting to 50% speeds and not getting exactly 50% of the max speed. A lot of this is PWM range. Keep in mind, fans often have a minimum floor for what they can spin at, first of all. So the scale isn't necessarily 0 to 1600. It might actually be more like 500 to 1600. And below that signal strength of whatever 500 RPM is, it'll just be off. So that's a consideration. Spinning with PWM versus DC, so going DC voltage is going to affect the fan speed in a different way than PWM. The PWM to RPM signal response will create a different RPM readout in your software than just DC voltage. So with pulse width modulation works differently than DC, where with DC you're just changing from like 12 volts to 7 or 10. It depends on kind of if the controller is linear stepping or if it's like hard points. Sometimes controllers are 3 hard points where it's like 12 volts, 7 volts, and 5 volts or something like that. And that would control the RPM instead. So that's a consideration. Software is a consideration. They all kind of read it slightly differently depending on what software you're using. We find hardware info to be the most accurate, so I'd recommend that. And I think that covers most of it. I'm sure I'm overlooking something. Fans have a lot of reasons for variance, but those are the main ones. It's manufacturing, hardware level tolerances, and then whether you're using pulse width modulation versus DC voltage control. And you can check that in BIOS if you're not sure. Your BIOS fan speed settings will give you the option to switch between them. Then the third thing being that the scale isn't 0 to X. It's actually minimum to X, minimum being often above 400 in most cases. Next one is from Krill89. Do you ever take a vacation, like go away on a 2-week vacation and not make videos that entire time? No. The only reason I really wanted to include this is to note that we've got the GN Steve side channel where I uploaded a few things recently from Whistler Bike Park, including talking about the GPU market while riding down a mountain at Whistler. So I try to get work involved whenever I can. We can't really take breaks from making videos, especially not for 2 weeks. The most I'll do is like, well, kind of before the LTX trip, the Linus Tech Expo trip, we did 6 videos in one day, and that covered us for the next 6 days. So that gives time to travel, still working during that time, but it allows me to work maybe only like 4 to 8 hours a day instead of whatever we normally do a lot, and also have videos like backed up, ready to go. So a lot of the time when you see videos sort of surrounding conventions, there's a good chance we filmed it like a week ago. But yeah, GN Steve side channel has some extra videos if you're interested in that kind of stuff, of mostly biking at this point. Some of it's biking while talking about hardware. Just for something different, gets the work involved everywhere I go. Next one, we've got 2 left. Vladnik, who says, would it be a good idea to put a little TIM between a component and a thermal pad to improve heat transfer? Like put the thermal paste on VRMs, put a thermal pad on top, or put a cooler on top of something else. So, or is it a waste of paste? The only reason to really do that is if you're having trouble with stuff sticking. So like if you're trying to seat a video card cooler and the thermal pads are falling off, they're not holding on, whatever, you can't get it to line up perfectly, you could put just a dab of thermal paste on maybe 3 components, just dotted along it. It's not going to improve the thermal transfer, it'll actually be worse. But if you just do a small bit for basically acting as glue, but not literally thermal adhesive, don't do that. If you do it just to act as a bit of adhesive, that will not inhibit the thermal transfer too much, and it'll help the pad stick. That's the only reason I would do it. Anytime you're adding thermal interfaces between the component and the cooling device, you're going to worsen the ability to cool. You're adding more layers for it to go through. You want the copper or whatever aluminum to be as close to the silicon as possible, and adding interfaces worsens that, increases that distance. So it's going to add more thermal resistance. Only use it if you need something that is not a literal thermal adhesive, but is still kind of sticky to hold the thermal pad in place. That's the only reason I would do that. Last one, Nory says, what has been the most outrageous proposition towards Snowflake that any vendor has done? So some vendors, case manufacturers are probably the worst about this. Case manufacturers send with their cases zip ties. Can you believe they're trying to bribe us by giving Snowflake toys? And frankly, I think it has to stop. And I know that you all don't get zip ties when you buy cases. So it's just, I find it really troubling that the big case manufacturing industry is shipping zip ties just with our cases to try and bribe our senior AMD analyst and sometimes CEO. There's gonna be a weird cut just like a second ago. So we got done filming this. This is a few days later now, and I realized I had one more special question from LTX. There was a kid there, I'll call him a kid, but he's in 6th grade. His name is Thomas, and he came up to me at LTX, and this is why I really admired that kid. He said to me that he basically moved on from Linus's content to ours because it was more technical, and then he moved on from ours to Buildzoids because we weren't technical enough for him. So holy crap, that kid's gonna be like a chief architect at Intel or NVIDIA someday. So the kid's name, he is Thomas, and he was at LTX with his dad. I talked to them both about career options and what he was interested in, tried to explain some of the YouTube space to his dad. It was a lot of fun, really inspiring to see that kind of interest in someone who's got so long to figure things out still. So Thomas asked me, and this, again, I'm cutting it in oddly because we forgot, and then it'll cut back to the rest of the video oddly, but Thomas asked me this. He said, after explaining to me that we're not good enough for him and he has to watch Buildzoid now, he said, what's the best video you've ever made? I have two answers here. I have the professional answer and I have the personal answer. So let me start with the professional answer. On the professional side, my favorite videos have been probably the Cooler Master feature in the, it was Cooler Master, Intel, and AMD. So we got 3 of the big companies that we criticized last year. And the video was Disappointment Build. So it's one of our more popular ones. We have a lot of unaired footage from that. We went out to an abandoned mall parking lot at like 2 a.m. Andrew's car battery died and everything, and because we were using it as a light. And we filmed an unaired clip of me pretending to run over the H500P, having second guesses, picking it up, putting it in the car, saving it. And then basically we cut to the Iron Man scene, which is what made it into the final cut. This is for the H500P mesh too. So it was basically, that was Disappointment Build, like inspiration. That all got shelved. We went with the attic scene that you saw later. And then we revived that idea for the H500P mesh, ditched the car scene, ditched the abandoned mall, and just went with the Iron Man scene where I'm like forging an H500P mesh in the garage basically. So that was a lot of fun. Second answer for the professional side, I really enjoyed the EVGA ACX versus ICX testing, and that's just because it kind of put us on the map for a lot of people. It was really interesting from a methodological point of view to devise the testing methodology, figure out how do we abuse these VRM components. So that was a lot of fun too. And also that's something that Thomas, our asker of this question, is interested in. It's VRMs and things like that. On the personal side of things, I'd have to say, and this is a weird answer, but 3D vision, of all things. So 3D vision wasn't particularly popular, but it's one of the few aspects of, as we grew and as I started to get review hardware in for the first time ever, this was one of the first things I got to review after a few cases and SSDs, and I got 3D vision in, and it's like the first review product that I got to show my dad, one of the only things that he got to see that I worked on, because, well, yeah, so he looked at 3D vision, really thought it was interesting, and so that was just fun for me, and something that I hang on to, because I don't get that opportunity now. So those are the 3 videos that I enjoyed the most. I don't know if we did a video for 3D vision, but I did an article, and despite looking back, despite kind of seeing it as really not the best technology, I found it very impressive at the time, and kind of like VR, where I found it like super impressive when I first tried it, really liked it, and then after that, it's just like, this is kind of a lot of work to set it up and use it, so I'm not going to bother. But I liked it at the time. So those are the answers. Thomas, thank you for your question. You have a bright future ahead of you if you keep hanging on to these. First of all, hopefully next year you can meet Buildzoid at some event, and you can say to him, Buildzoid, you know what? I used to love your content, but frankly, you're not technical enough for me anymore. I've moved on to, but I don't know who else you can move on to at that point. But hopefully you figure something out, because you're going to run out of content to consume at your skill level pretty soon. So thank you for the questions. Really cool to meet you guys. Thomas and Thomas's dad, if you ever have questions about jobs in the industry, find me. You can email me. It's on the website, and I'll help you out. So thanks for watching, guys. I'm going to cut back to the rest of this video now, and hopefully the timeline's not too screwed up because I'm not a video editor anymore, so I'll do my best to bridge it together. So that's it for this one. There'll be another episode as well, and the Patreon behind the scenes episode. If you go to the patreon.com/GamersNexus website, you can check out at any of the backer tiers the extra bonus episode. Otherwise, check the main channel for the second one of this if it's not up already. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our new posters, like this one right here, and you can go to questions below for next time. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.